I want you to close your eyes for a second. Just vividly imagine that you are a young woman living in Vienna, and it's 1846. You are pregnant.
Which is terrifying enough on its own in the mid-19th century.
Well, exactly. But as your time draws near, instead of like anticipation, you are gripped by absolute paralyzing terror. And you aren't just terrified of childbirth itself, you are terrified of a very specific building.
Right, the great free hospital in the city, the Vienna General Hospital.
Yeah. And if you live in this neighborhood, you know the dark kind of mathematical reality of the two maternity wards inside that towering stone building.
It was a massive institution, totally imposing and unavoidable if you were a working-class citizen.
Right. And you know that if they send you to the second clinic, you have a decent chance of surviving. But if the hospital administrators try to steer you toward the first clinic, your chances of dying absolutely skyrocketed.
It was essentially a death sentence.
Yeah.
A known, horrifying fact of the city that every pregnant woman whispered about.
It really was. So you don't just passively accept your fate. If you're a pregnant woman in 1846 and they try to check you into that first clinic, you drop to your knees.
You literally beg them.
Yes, you weep. You beg the administrators, the nurses, anyone who will listen to please just send you to the second clinic.
And if they refuse?
If they refuse, you turn around, you walk out into the freezing cold, and you deliberately give birth in the filthy, open cobblestone streets.
Wow.
Because somehow you have figured out that the literal dirt and horse manure of the street is actually safer than the pristine, sterile-looking beds of that hospital.
And, I mean, the most chilling part of those historical accounts is that the women were completely justified in their panic.
Yeah, the math backed them up.
Exactly. The street was inherently safer.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We're looking at a vast stack of notes, historical records, and medical accounts surrounding a man named Ignaz Semmelweis.
And this is such a wild story.
It really is. I have to tell you, this isn't just some dry medical history lesson. It's a detective story. I mean, it's a psychological thriller.
Oh, absolutely.
Our mission today is to figure out how this one doctor, Semmelweis, walked into this house of horrors and basically solved what might be the most deadly medical mystery of his century.
Right, and we really need to establish the stakes here right up front, because this deep dive is about far more than just, a historical medical discovery.
Yeah, it's way bigger than that.
It is fundamentally a story about a fatal flaw in human nature.
Mm-hmm.
The tragedy hidden in all these sources is that Semmelweis didn't just have a hunch.
Right, he had the receipts.
Exactly. He found a provable, undeniable, life-saving truth. A truth that, if it had been implemented immediately, could have saved millions of lives globally.
Millions.
But the medical establishment of his day looked at his mountain of evidence,
Wow.
looked at the plummeting death rates, and just utterly rejected it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how the greatest medical minds of Europe could look at a literal cure and say, no thanks, we really have to understand the paradigm they were operating under.
You have to get into their heads.
Right. We need to look at what medicine actually consisted of in the mid-19th century. Because to my modern brain, the idea of doctors ignoring a plummeting death rate is completely baffling.
It is baffling. But to grasp the mindset of the 1840s, we have to look closely at the specific enemy they were fighting.
The disease itself.
Right. The disease stalking these maternity wards was known as puerperal fever, or childbed fever. Today, modern medicine recognizes it as a highly virulent form of sepsis.
And sepsis is one of those words that sounds scary, but I don't think we always appreciate the biological mechanism of what's actually happening.
No, we really don't.
From my understanding, it's not just an infection, it's a catastrophic, cascading failure of the body's own systems.
That is a crucial distinction. Sepsis occurs when an infection, in this case, originating in the reproductive tract right after birth, enters the bloodstream.
And the body just overreacts.
Basically, yes. The human immune system detects the bacteria and essentially panics. It launches such a massive systemic inflammatory response to fight the invaders that it actually begins to damage the body's own tissues.
Oh, wow. So it's destroying itself.
Exactly. Blood pressure plummets catastrophically, which prevents oxygen from reaching major organs.
And a woman who has just given birth is incredibly vulnerable to this, right? Because, the placenta detaching from the uterine wall leaves a massive internal wound.
It's effectively a direct open highway straight into her bloodstream.
Right. So if bacteria get in there is literally nothing to stop them.
And the progression of the disease is uniquely cruel. You have to remember, a woman would go through the immense physical trauma of an 1800s childbirth.
Which was brutal enough.
Right. And she survives it. The baby is delivered. She seems completely healthy.
But she's a ticking time bomb.
Yes. The bacteria are already multiplying in her bloodstream.
Then, a day or two later, the nightmare begins. She gets agonizing abdominal pain, a racing pulse.
A soaring, relentless fever.
Yeah. And within days, sometimes literally within hours of that very first symptom, she goes into multiple organ failure and dies.
It was incredibly fast.
But the statistics in the source material are just staggering. In the maternity hospitals of Europe during this era, in the really bad stretches, childbed fever was killing 1 in 5 new mothers.
1 in 5. It's almost hard to comprehend.
It is, and the doctors were completely helpless to stop it, which kind of brings us to the core scientific blind spot of the era.
Right, a lack of germ theory.
Exactly. In the 1840s, the concept of a germ simply did not exist.
No. The idea that microscopic living organisms could cause disease and be passed from person to person, that was decades away from being scientifically established.
They literally had no idea.
None. They had no microscopes powerful enough to see bacteria, and honestly no conceptual framework to even imagine invisible biological killers.
It makes me think of an analogy. Imagine trying to fix a complex computer system that keeps crashing, but you live in a world where nobody knows that software exists.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Like nobody knows what a computer virus or a corrupted file is. So the computer keeps blue screening, and the IT professionals of the day are just aggressively wiping down the keyboard.
Changing the power cord.
Yeah, changing the cord, maybe adjusting the room temperature, and just hoping that fixes the internal code. They're trying to solve a microscopic, invisible problem by manipulating the big, visible environment.
That perfectly captures the futility of their efforts.
Yeah.
They were entirely focused on the macro environment because they had no concept of the microbiology.
So what did they think was causing it?
Well, without germs, the greatest medical minds of the 19th century relied on the reigning paradigm of the time, which was the miasma theory.
Miasma. Just the word itself sounds, I don't know, sinister and archaic.
It does. Miasma theory was the belief that diseases were caused by foul vapors, rotting matter, and essentially just bad air.
Bad air.
Yes. And the logic, flawed as it was, stemmed from actual observation. Swamps smelled terrible, and people near swamps got malaria.
Wait, doesn't malaria literally translate to bad air?
It literally translates to bad air, yes. So they deduced that the smell itself, the literal vapor of decay, was the vector of illness.
So if a maternity ward had a 20% death rate, the doctors wouldn't even look at their own tools or hands.
Never.
They would point to the air quality, they would blame, like, a sudden shift in the barometric pressure, or bad air blowing in from the city's open sewers.
Or they would blame mysterious internal factors. Some argued the fever was caused by a blockage of the mother's milk.
Blocked milk.
Yeah, or a spontaneous internal putrefaction, or even just a woman's emotional state.
You mean she was just too stressed out?
Exactly. The theory was that she was simply too anxious, and her delicate constitution collapsed.
What stands out to me about all of this is how incredibly convenient the miasma theory is for the people in charge.
What's fascinating here is the profound psychological comfort that the miasma theory provided to the medical establishment.
Oh, absolutely.
Just consider the doctor's perspective for a moment. You are an elite, highly educated physician, yet you are losing 1 in 5 of your patients.
Which is an unimaginable failure.
A horrifying professional failure. But if childbed fever is caused by the weather, or bad atmospheric vapors, or a woman's inherent emotional frailty, then these deaths are tragic, sure, but they are natural.
And they're not your fault.
Crucially, they're unpreventable.
It just lets the doctors completely off the hook. If it's the weather's fault, the doctor is just this noble bystander doing his absolute best against the overwhelming forces of nature.
Exactly. They don't have to question their own practices, their own hygiene, or their own competence.
Because the killer is this invisible atmospheric ghost.
It insulated their egos completely. They could attend a disastrous birth and go home feeling they had done everything medically possible.
Enter Ignaz Semmelweis. It's 1846, and he is a 28-year-old Hungarian doctor arriving to take up an assistant post at the maternity clinic of the Vienna General Hospital.
A very young, very driven guy.
Yeah, and the defining characteristic of Semmelweis, the engine that drives this entire narrative, really, is that he simply cannot accept the unpreventable weather excuse.
He refuses to just shrug his shoulders at a 20% mortality rate.
So Semmelweis walks into the Vienna General Hospital, and without meaning to, he steps into the middle of one of the most remarkable natural experiments in the history of medicine.
It really was a perfect setup for a scientific study, entirely by accident.
Yeah. The hospital's maternity service was so massive that it had to be split into two entirely separate clinics, the first clinic and the second clinic.
And the structural setup of these clinics is what turns this from just a tragedy into a solvable puzzle.
Right, because of how they admitted the patients?
Yes, women were admitted to these clinics based strictly on the day of the week they arrived.
Which is wild.
It was essentially random assignment. Monday admissions went to the first clinic, Tuesday admissions went to the second clinic, and so on.
So you have the exact same demographic of women, mostly poor, working-class mothers, often unmarried, who relied on the free city hospital.
Right. They are in the exact same building. They are breathing the exact same, quote-unquote, miasma air.
Eating the same hospital food, everything is the same.
The variables were almost entirely controlled by sheer bureaucratic coincidence, except for one massively significant difference in how the clinics were staffed.
The personnel.
Right. The first clinic was the prestigious teaching ward for medical students and doctors. The second clinic was the training ward for midwives.
And the discrepancy in the outcomes between these two groups is the terrifying math we talked about at the very beginning.
The numbers are stark.
In the first clinic, the one run by the highly educated, scientifically trained elite doctors and medical students, the mortality rate was horrifying. It sat around 10% and frequently spiked to over 18%.
Nearly 1 in 5 healthy women walking in and never walking out.
But in the second clinic, the one run entirely by the midwives, the death rate was a fraction of that.
A tiny fraction.
Usually hovering between 2% and 4%.
Which, for an era before antibiotics or modern sanitation, was an incredibly successful survival rate.
I want you, the listener, to think about how maddening that is. Just put yourself in Semmelweis' shoes for a moment.
It would drive you crazy.
You are a doctor in the first clinic, losing up to 18% of your patients. Down the hall, literally in the same building, the midwives are losing 2%.
Right. It screams that something happening in the doctor's clinic is actively killing people.
Under the miasma theory, that discrepancy is completely unexplainable. Bad air doesn't politely stop at the doorway of the midwives' clinic.
No, it doesn't. But the other doctors saw that discrepancy and just contorted their logic to make it fit their worldview.
What kind of excuses did they make?
Oh, they blamed the anxiety of the medical students, or they argued that the first clinic somehow had poor ventilation, despite being in the very same building.
We're just reaching for anything.
Exactly. Semmelweis, however, departs entirely from the traditional medical thinking of his peers. He decides to act like a forensic detective.
He applies a systematic, almost modern scientific method. He stops theorizing from a comfortable armchair and starts actually isolating variables on the ground.
But he doesn't know what he's looking for yet.
Right. If it's not the air, what are the actual differences between the two wards? He has to deduce it.
So he begins testing the prevalent theories of the day, no matter how absurd they might seem to us now. For instance, there was a theory that overcrowding caused a concentration of bad air.
Which seems somewhat logical if you believe in bad air. So he looks at the hospital census, but he finds the exact opposite is true.
Right. Because the women of Vienna were so utterly terrified of the first clinic, they would do anything to delay their admission until it was a midwife day.
Right. So as a result, the second clinic was actually much more crowded.
Women were packed into beds there.
Yet their death rate was vastly lower. So boom, the overcrowding theory is dead.
Next, he looks at clinical practices. He notes that women in the doctor's clinic delivered their babies lying on their backs, while women in the midwife's clinic delivered on their sides.
So he tests that.
Right. Semmelweis mandates that the first clinic change the birthing position to match the midwives. He enforces lateral deliveries.
He changes the variable, observes the data, and nothing happens. The death rate remains astronomically high, so the birthing position is completely irrelevant.
He is clearing suspects one by one, which eventually leads him to investigate the psychological theories of disease.
And these were surprisingly prominent in 19th century medicine, weren't they?
Very prominent, yes.
This detail from the sources completely blew my mind. There was a genuine, academically supported hypothesis that the deaths were psychosomatic.
Yes, the priest and the bell.
Exactly. Part of the daily routine in the hospital involved a Catholic priest who would walk through the wards to deliver extreme unction or last rites to the dying patients.
A very common practice.
And to signal his arrival, he would ring a bell as he walked down the hall.
A constant, audible reminder of impending death.
In the first clinic, the architectural layout meant the priest had to walk directly past the beds of all the healthy, recovering women just to get to the dying ones, ringing this bell the entire time.
And the medical establishment seriously posited that the sound of this bell and the terrifying sight of the priest was literally scaring the healthy women to death.
They believed the psychological shock was so severe it induced a fatal biological fever.
It just highlights how desperate they were for an explanation that didn't implicate their own medical practices.
Totally. But Semmelweis treats it as a legitimate hypothesis to be tested.
He was very thorough.
He approaches the priest and requests change in protocol. He asks him to alter his route, to avoid the recovering mothers entirely, and above all, to silence the bell.
And the priest agrees. He sneaks into the ward quietly. No bell, no terrifying procession, no psychological shock.
And Semmelweis watches the data, and the women keep dying at the exact same rate.
So the psychological terror theory is completely debunked.
He is systematically running out of variables to test. Every logical and illogical suspect has been cleared.
Which brings us back to the anomaly that we used to open this deep dive, the street births.
Yes. Women who were caught in labor on a doctor's day would often deliberately give birth in the freezing, filthy dirt of the Vienna streets.
Right, and then they'd claim they simply couldn't make it to the hospital in time.
Which allowed them to be admitted for postpartum care without having delivered in the deadly first clinic. And those women almost never contracted childbed fever.
When you view that fact through the lens of the miasma theory, the entire paradigm just shatters.
Makes no sense.
The streets of a 19th-century European city were essentially open sewers. They were filled with horse manure, rotting garbage, stagnant water.
So if bad smells and atmospheric filth cause disease, the women giving birth in the literal gutter should have been dying at the highest rates of all.
But they were surviving.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Semmelweis is looking at this complete paradox. The hospital environment is deadly. The dirty street is safe.
Right.
Therefore, the danger cannot be the physical environment. The danger isn't the air, it isn't the beds, it isn't the linens, it isn't the bell. It has to be the people inside the hospital.
Specifically, the doctors.
It's the only variable left on the board. The midwives are safe, the streets are safe, the doctors are lethal.
But reaching that conclusion isn't a moment of triumph for Semmelweis.
No, it's a moment of profound psychological horror.
Because he has a suspicion, a very dark, inescapable suspicion, that he and his esteemed colleagues are somehow the cause of this mass death.
But he has absolutely no mechanism to explain it. He doesn't know how they are causing it.
And the sources indicate that this realization, combined with the sheer unrelenting volume of death he was witnessing every single day, began to severely torment him mentally.
It's an unimaginable cognitive burden. You take an oath to do no harm, you dedicate your life to medicine, and you are slowly realizing that your own clinic, your own hands, might be the slaughterhouse.
And you're entirely powerless to figure out why.
So in early 1847, Semmelweis is so overwhelmed by the stress and the constant specter of death that he takes a leave of absence.
He travels to Venice, Italy.
Right, just to physically escape the hospital, to get some distance, and to try and clear his head.
And it is precisely during this trip that the universe delivers the final missing piece of the puzzle.
But it delivers it in the most heartbreaking, tragic way imaginable.
Truly.
While Semmelweis is walking the canals of Venice trying to recover his sanity, he has a very dear friend and colleague back in Vienna, a professor of forensic medicine named Jakob Kolletschka.
Kolletschka is supervising an autopsy with some medical students.
Which is a standard part of their daily routine.
Exactly. They're dissecting a corpse. And during this procedure, one of the students' scalpels slips, and it accidentally pricks Kolletschka's finger.
Just a tiny cut.
A minor workplace accident that happens all the time in medical training.
Under normal circumstances, it would just be a brief annoyance, but within days, Kolletschka falls violently ill, and very quickly he dies a painful, agonizing death.
Semmelweis returns from Venice. He's refreshed. He's ready to get back to the puzzle of the first clinic.
And immediately upon his return, He is handed the autopsy and medical report detailing his dear friend's sudden death.
He sits down to read it.
And as he reads the symptoms that Kolletschka suffered in his final days, the soaring fever, the agonizing abdominal pain, the cascading inflammation, the pus found in his veins and organs, Semmelweis experiences a horrifying moment of complete clarity.
The pathology report was unmistakable. The symptoms Kolletschka suffered matched the progression of childbed fever exactly.
But Kolletschka was a man. He wasn't a mother. He wasn't pregnant.
He certainly hadn't given birth.
No. So this completely shattered the idea that childbed fever was a disease exclusive to the female reproductive system.
It wasn't caused by blocked milk or the trauma of labor.
It was a pathogen. It was a poison. And the only variable in Kolletschka's case was that a blade, which had just been inside the decaying tissue of a dead body, punctured his skin and entered his bloodstream.
This is the exact moment the entire mystery violently clicks into place. Semmelweis traces the steps of the doctors in his clinic.
What were they actually doing every day?
Right, he looks at the daily routine of the elite physicians and the medical students in the first clinic. How do they start their day? They spent their early mornings down in the morgue, dissecting corpses to learn anatomy.
And crucially, many of those corpses were the bodies of the very women who had died the day before from childbed fever.
They are literally up to their elbows in the infected necrotic tissue of the dead.
And then the morning anatomy lesson finishes. And without washing their hands, or at most casually wiping them on a dry rag or their coats, they walk straight upstairs to the maternity ward.
And with those exact same bare, unwashed hands, they begin performing internal vaginal examinations on living, healthy women who are in the incredibly vulnerable, torn state of labor.
It is genuinely horrific to conceptualize. They were carrying the disease directly from the morgue into the birth canal.
And if we look back at the midwives in the second clinic,
Right.
the midwives were not scientifically trained in the same manner. They were not permitted to perform dissections. They never set foot in the morgue. They never touched a corpse.
Their hands were clean of the dead.
Exactly.
Semmelweis realizes the devastating truth. The doctors were the murder weapon. Every single morning, they were taking death from the morgue, carrying it on their own hands, and directly implanting it into the bodies of the mothers they were trying to save.
It's an agonizing realization.
Because these doctors weren't malicious, they weren't evil, they were actively trying to be progressive scientific doctors by studying anatomy to better understand the human body.
But out of sheer ignorance of microbiology, they were slaughtering their own patients.
So Semmelweis has this monumental breakthrough. He knows as we established earlier, he didn't have the word germ or bacteria to explain what was on their hands.
No, he didn't know about the microscopic immune cascade of sepsis.
So how did he articulate what they were transmitting?
He came up with the most accurate term he could, based purely on observation. He called them cadaverous particles.
Cadaverous particles.
Yes. He theorized that there was some invisible, deadly, decaying matter from the corpses that clung to the doctor's skin. When introduced to a wound like Kolletschka's cut finger or the torn uterus of a birthing mother, these particles poison the blood and cause the fatal fever.
So he knows the cadaverous particles on their hands are the culprit. But if you can't see the particles, how do you know how to destroy them?
It requires another leap of brilliant deductive reasoning. He knows that ordinary soap and water aren't enough.
How does he know that?
The evidence for this is right in front of him. Doctors did occasionally wash their hands with soap, but Semmelweis noticed that the sweet, cloying, foul smell of the morgue still lingered on their fingers even after washing.
Oh, that's vile.
Right. So he reasoned that if the microscopic particles causing the smell survived the soap, whatever was causing the disease probably survived it too.
So he needs something chemical, something nuclear. He needs a substance that utterly annihilates the physical presence of death on their skin.
Exactly. He selects a harsh chemical solution, chlorinated lime.
Essentially a heavy-duty calcium hypochlorite bleach.
Right. And he doesn't choose it because he understands its antimicrobial properties.
Yeah.
He doesn't know microbes exist.
So why the bleach?
He chooses it for one specific, observable reason. Chlorine is an incredible oxidizing agent. It is strong enough to completely strip the volatile organic compounds, the odor of the corpses, from their skin.
He figures if it destroys the smell, it destroys the cadaverous particles. So in May of 1847, Semmelweis posts a strict, uncompromising notice in the first clinic. It is a mandate. Before anyone, any doctor, any student, any assistant is allowed to touch a single mother, they must scrub their hands intensely in a basin of this chlorinated lime solution.
And then They wait. The intervention is in place, and all they can do is watch the daily hospital census.
And the numbers that come back are they're the most incredible, triumphant part of this entire deep dive.
They really are.
You have to understand how dramatic this shift was. In April 1847, the month right before the hand-washing rule went into effect, the death rate in the first clinic was sitting at over 18%.
It was a literal slaughterhouse.
Mid-May, the strict chlorine scrubbing begins. By June, the death rate in the doctor's clinic plummets to just over 2%.
Amazing.
In July, it drops to around 1%. And as Semmelweis aggressively enforces this rule, threatening to fire anyone who skips the basin, within a year, there are actually consecutive months where the death rate in the doctor's clinic hits absolute zero.
Zero. In a ward that was previously losing nearly 1 in 5 women, the mortality rate completely vanished. The intervention was an unqualified mathematical success.
It's a miracle. I mean, he found the invisible killer, he deduced its origin, he built a chemical wall to stop it, and he brought the mortality rate down to 0.
Yep.
So logically, he fixed it. He saved the mothers. He solved the greatest puzzle of 19th-century obstetrics.
Mm.
By any rational standard, he should be carrying a Nobel Prize.
You would certainly think so.
He should be paraded through the streets of Vienna on the shoulders of the senior medical staff, right?
In a purely rational world, evidence that dramatic, backed by meticulous hospital records and undeniable statistics, would change medical science overnight. But the history of science is rarely purely rational. Instead of a parade, Semmelweis hit a massive, immovable, institutional wall of resistance.
The Great Rejection.
The medical establishment of Europe looked at his 0% death rate and rejected his findings entirely.
Reading the source notes on this part is incredibly frustrating. They have the records. The ledger shows the death rate dropping from 18% to 0.
In black and white.
How could they possibly justify rejecting a life-saving protocol that costs nothing but a bucket of chlorine?
To understand the rejection, we have to peel back several layers of the 19th century scientific mindset, starting with the immense power of human ego.
Ego, of course.
Think about what Semmelweis was actually proposing to these senior doctors. He wasn't just introducing a new surgical technique or a new medicine. His theory was, fundamentally, an accusation of manslaughter.
I see what you mean. If washing your hands saves the mothers, that unavoidably implies that not washing your hands is what was actively killing them for the past decade.
Precisely. To accept Semmelweis's theory, the most elite, highly educated, universally respected physicians in Europe would have to stand up in front of their peers, their students, and the public, and admit that for years they had personally, physically, caused the agonized deaths of thousands of their own patients.
Wow, the guilt, the potential legal liability, and just the devastating blow to their professional pride would be astronomical.
It's a level of cognitive dissonance that the human brain will do almost anything to avoid.
And beyond the guilt, there was a deeply ingrained classism at play here, wasn't there?
Absolutely. We have to remember the social hierarchy of the 1840s. These doctors were wealthy gentlemen of high society. They viewed themselves as fundamentally clean, elevated individuals.
So the idea that they were dirty was insulting.
Very. The idea that a gentleman's hands could be intrinsically unclean or carry disease was highly offensive to their delicate sensibilities. The dirt of the lower classes carried disease, not the hands of an aristocrat.
They literally thought, I am a gentleman of high society, my hands are inherently pure. How dare you suggest I scrub them in bleach like a common laborer?
Exactly that.
It's pure arrogance blinding them to empirical data. But it wasn't just wounded pride, was it? There was a genuine structural problem with how science operated at the time.
Yes. The second major reason for the rejection was the lack of an accepted biological mechanism.
Right.
And to understand this, it helps to look at the philosophy of science. In the mid-20th century, a philosopher named Thomas Kuhn wrote a famous book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions.
Oh, I've heard of this.
Kuhn argued that science doesn't advance by a slow, steady accumulation of facts. Instead, scientists operate within a paradigm, a universally accepted framework, like the miasma theory.
So when a piece of data comes along that doesn't fit the paradigm, they don't immediately throw out the paradigm, they throw out the data.
Exactly. Kuhn called these non-fitting pieces of data anomalies. Semmelweis could prove that hand washing worked. He had the statistical data, but he could not prove why it worked.
Because he couldn't put a petri dish under a microscope and show them the bacteria.
He didn't have the biological vocabulary. To the scientific establishment deeply entrenched in the miasma paradigm, A result without a theoretical mechanism was just an annoying anomaly.
It didn't fit into their understanding of the universe.
So they dismissed the data rather than endure the painful process of updating their entire worldview.
The mental gymnastics they perform to ignore the data are just astonishing. The source notes mention that some rival doctors actually cooked the books.
Yes, they did.
They massaged the hospital's mortality data, changing how deaths were categorized, just to make it look like the chlorine hand washing didn't really have a statistically significant effect.
Unbelievable.
And the director of the clinic, Semmelweis's own boss, a man named Johann Klein, saw the death rate drop to 0 and publicly credited a new ventilation system that had recently been installed in the hospital.
The bad air paradigm was so deeply entrenched that Professor Klein would rather credit a mechanical fan for saving lives than a chemical hand wash, because the fan fit the existing miasma theory.
It's a perfect example of confirmation bias. But as much as I want to frame this as a story of a flawless hero surrounded by corrupt villains, we have to address the reality of this situation.
They do.
And the reality is that Semmelweis was profoundly flawed in how he handled this.
That is a crucial point. While it's tempting to mythologize Semmelweis as the lone genius fighting the establishment, we have to look objectively at his actions. The third major reason his theory failed to catch on was that Semmelweis was his own worst enemy.
I'm glad we are addressing this because the myth of the perfect martyr ignores how much communication matters in science. Semmelweis makes this world-changing discovery in 1847. The death rate goes to 0. He has the data.
Right.
Guess how long it took him to actually sit down and formally publish his findings in a medical journal for peer review?
It took him 14 years.
14 years. He has a cure that could save the lives of millions of women across the globe, and he just refuses to write a paper about it.
He hated writing.
He let a few of his students and friends give informal lectures about it. He let secondary sources publish brief accounts in medical weeklies. But he wouldn't publish the hard, comprehensive data himself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of how scientific progress actually works, the discovery of truth is only 50% of the job.
And the other 50%.
Communication and persuasion. If you want the scientific community to overturn centuries of established medical doctrine, you have to present the data formally, clearly, and persuasively. You cannot rely on rumors and secondhand lectures.
And when Semmelweis finally did start trying to communicate his findings directly, his approach was an absolute disaster. He was incredibly dogmatic and inflexible.
Very. He insisted, with absolute rigidity, that corpse matter, these cadaverous particles exclusively from the morgue, was the sole and only cause of childbed fever.
Which, if you know anything about sepsis, isn't entirely scientifically accurate. We know today that puerperal fever can be caused by various strains of bacteria, like streptococcus, from multiple different sources, not exclusively from dissecting corpses.
Right.
Sometimes the fever would strike a ward even when no doctors had been anywhere near the morgue, perhaps spreading from contaminated bed linens, dirty surgical instruments, or from another infected patient in the ward.
And when other progressive doctors pointed out these legitimate exceptions, asking valid scientific questions about why women still occasionally got sick without corpse involvement, Semmelweis didn't take the opportunity to refine his theory.
He didn't expand his concept of cadaverous particles to include other sources of contamination.
No. Instead, he dug his heels in completely.
He became incredibly combative. As the years went on and the medical community continued to ignore or question him, his frustration curdled into profound bitterness.
He started writing these furious, unhinged open letters.
Yeah, to the most prominent doctors and professors of obstetrics in Europe. He publicly called them irresponsible murderers and ignoramuses.
Now, objectively speaking, he might have been factually correct. Their obstinate refusal to wash their hands was causing preventable deaths.
But politically?
Politically and practically. Calling your esteemed colleagues murderers in public print is not a strategy designed to win hearts, change minds, or shift paradigms. He alienated the very people whose influence he desperately needed to spread the practice.
It's worth noting, too, from the sources that Semmelweis wasn't entirely alone in suspecting doctors were the vectors of disease.
No, there were others.
Across the Atlantic, in America, there was a highly respected physician and writer named Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr.
Right.
In 1843, 4 years before Semmelweis's breakthrough, Holmes had actually published a brilliant essay arguing that childbed fever was contagious and was being carried from patient to patient by the dirty hands and clothing of the doctors themselves.
Exactly. The idea was beginning to percolate in the scientific ether, But Holmes' argument was largely based on theoretical deduction and horrifying anecdotal cases of doctors who lost patient after patient.
Holmes didn't have a controlled clinical environment.
Right. Semmelweis, on the other hand, had the hard, undeniable mathematical hospital data from Vienna. Semmelweis had the empirical proof.
But because of the establishment's pride, the lack of a microscopic mechanism, and Semmelweis's own abrasive, self-sabotaging communication style, that proof was effectively buried.
Which leads us into the tragic unraveling of Ignaz Semmelweis. In 1849, despite his monumental success in saving lives, his contract at the Vienna General Hospital, the very hospital where he had single-handedly driven the maternal death rate to zero, was not renewed.
Professor Klein made sure of it. They effectively fired him.
They pushed the savior of the mothers out the door.
He was abruptly exiled from Vienna, the glittering center of European medicine. Defeated, deeply wounded, and humiliated, he leaves Austria and returns home to Hungary, settling in the city of Pest.
It's a massive fall from grace. But the most important, enduring detail of his time in Hungary is that the science never betrayed him.
The biology didn't change just because the geography did.
This is a crucial point that highlights the universality of his discovery. His method kept working. In Pest, he takes an unpaid, honorary position taking over the maternity wards at a local hospital that was suffering from a massive outbreak of childbed fever.
And what does he do?
He immediately enforces his strict chlorine hand-washing rule on the staff. And immediately, the mothers stop dying. The death rate plummets to under 1%.
So it still works.
Everywhere he went, if he had the administrative authority to force doctors and students to wash their hands in chlorine, lives were saved. The empirical evidence never abandoned him, only the scientific community did.
So he tries to build a normal life in Pest. He establishes a successful private practice. He gets married. He has several children. In 1855, he is appointed as a professor of obstetrics at the University of Pest.
A respected local figure.
And finally, in 1861, 14 long, agonizing years after his initial breakthrough in Vienna, he publishes his masterwork, a comprehensive 500-page book detailing his life's work on the causes, concept, and prophylaxis of childbed fever.
He finally puts the data out into the world.
Yeah.
And it completely flopped.
It landed with a total thud in the medical community. The reviews in the medical journals were largely dismissive or outright cruel.
They found the book to be a rambling, repetitive, disorganized mess of statistics and bitter personal attacks.
He had waited half his professional life for this moment of vindication, and the medical world basically yawned, mocked him, and looked away.
And that final, definitive rejection seems to have been the catalyst that broke him. Through the early 1860s, Semmelweis began to noticeably, rapidly deteriorate.
The historical notes describe how he became entirely consumed by the fight. It became an obsession that swallowed his personality. Every conversation he had, regardless of the topic, eventually came back to the topic of childbed fever.
He couldn't let it go.
He was haunted by the memory of the women who had died in his ward in Vienna, and he was psychologically tortured by the knowledge that women were still dying agonizing deaths all over Europe simply because arrogant doctors refused to wash their hands.
His professional and personal behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began drinking heavily. His letters, as we mentioned, became even wilder and more vitriolic.
It's just so sad.
Now, it is important to note that medical historians still passionately debate the exact biological root cause of this severe mental decline.
Right. Was it a disease or was it trauma?
Exactly. Some argue it was an organic physical disease that destroyed his brain, perhaps early onset Alzheimer's disease, or neurosyphilis, which was an occupational hazard for obstetricians who frequently examined infected patients.
But others argue that his breakdown was purely the result of psychological trauma. The slow, crushing, unbearable weight of knowing a universal truth, having the power to save millions of lives, and being mocked, marginalized, and ignored for 20 years while the slaughter continued unabated.
Honestly, it's a burden that would likely shatter anyone's sanity. Imagine screaming a simple, life-saving truth into the void for 2 decades, while the people you are desperately trying to save continue to drop dead all around you, murdered by the very people sworn to protect them.
I can't even imagine.
By the summer of 1865, Semmelweis's family, his wife, and his colleagues are deeply alarmed by his aggressive and unstable mental state, and they make a tragic, fateful decision.
They decide he needs to be committed to an institution.
Right, but they know he won't go willingly, so they don't tell him the truth. A colleague lures him to a mental asylum in Vienna, under the guise of visiting a new medical facility to consult on a case.
When they arrive at the asylum, the doors are locked behind him, and Semmelweis instantly realizes what is happening. He realizes he has been trapped.
He tries to escape. He struggles violently with the asylum guards.
The historical accounts suggest he was severely beaten by the staff to subdue him, forced into a straitjacket, and thrown into a locked, dark cell.
And here's where we reach the final and perhaps the most unbearable, devastating irony of Ignaz Semmelweis' life.
It's hard to even read this part.
During the violent struggle with the guards at the asylum, Semmelweis suffered a wound, a cut or a deep bruise on his hand or arm that broke the skin.
In the filthy, unsanitary conditions of a 19th-century mental asylum, that wound quickly became deeply infected.
The bacteria entered his wound. The infection spread into his bloodstream, cascading into full-blown systemic sepsis.
2 weeks after he was committed, on August 13, 1865, at the age of just 47, Ignaz Semmelweis died.
He died of blood poisoning, a fatal body-wide septic infection.
The exact same biological mechanism that killed the mothers in his maternity ward.
The exact same disease he had spent his entire adult life trying to understand and cure.
The savior of the mothers died of the disease of the mothers, and all it would have taken to save his life was a basin of chlorinated water.
It is a profoundly devastating end. And adding insult to injury, his death went almost entirely unnoticed by the medical community that he had tried so desperately hard to reform. There were barely any obituaries.
But the story doesn't quite end there in the asylum, does it? Because history did catch up to Semmelweis, and the speed at which it caught up almost makes the tragedy worse.
That is the cruelest historical footnote. Semmelweis was completely, provably right about the transmission of disease. And within just a few short years of his lonely death in that locked cell, the entire paradigm of medical science finally shifted.
The miasma theory collapsed, and the truth he had hunted for was revealed.
Yes. In the 1860s, while Semmelweis is deteriorating in Hungary and dying in Vienna, a brilliant chemist in France named Louis Pasteur is meticulously assembling the undeniable microscopic evidence for germ theory.
Pasteur is the one who finally proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that tiny living microorganisms, germs, actually exist.
And that they cause disease and decay, and most importantly, that they could be transferred from place to place.
And shortly after Pasteur publishes his groundbreaking work, a British surgeon named Joseph Lister reads it. Lister has a light bulb moment.
He realizes that these microscopic germs described by Pasteur are what cause his surgical patients' incisions to become infected and gangrenous.
So Lister begins using antiseptic chemicals, specifically a solution of carbolic acid, to kill the germs on his surgical instruments and his own hands before operating.
And just like Semmelweis did in Vienna, Lister watches his surgical mortality rates plummet.
Joseph Lister publishes his results, he presents his mechanisms clearly, and he goes down in history as a hero. He is knighted by Queen Victoria, he is celebrated worldwide as the father of modern antiseptic surgery, and they even name Listerine mouthwash after him.
And Lister certainly deserves his accolades. His communication and clinical application were masterful. But fundamentally, biologically, Lister was just proving why Semmelweis had been right a generation earlier.
Pasteur's microscopic germ was the exact same biological entity as Semmelweis's cadaverous particle.
Semmelweis could sense the enemy, he could track its movements through the hospital, and he figured out exactly how to kill it with chlorine.
He just didn't have the microscopic lens powerful enough to see it and prove its existence to a skeptical world.
Once germ theory became the accepted, mainstream science, everything Semmelweis had been screaming about for 20 years suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense.
The older generation of doctors looked back at the data from the Vienna General Hospital and realized, oh my God, we really were carrying microscopic killers on our hands from the morgue into the maternity ward.
Today, Semmelweis is finally honored the way he should have been in life. A major medical university in Budapest bears his name. There are statues of him.
He is recognized globally by the medical community as the father of infection control.
But all those statues and named buildings came way too late for him. And far more tragically, they came way too late for the tens of thousands of women who died agonizing, preventable deaths in the intervening years between his discovery in 1847 and the widespread acceptance of germ theory.
His story is so iconic and has left such a profound mark on the philosophy of science and psychology that there is actually a behavioral term named after him.
Yes, it's called the Semmelweis reflex.
It describes the reflexive, automatic human tendency to reject new evidence or new knowledge simply because it contradicts established norms, beliefs, or paradigms.
It is a cognitive bias that we are all susceptible to.
The Semmelweis reflex. We see it all the time in modern society. But I want to bring this directly back to you, the listener, because this deep dive isn't just a grim historical story about arrogant doctors in top hats in the 1800s.
No, this is fundamentally about the world we live in right now.
Think about it. Hand-washing, the exact intervention that Semmelweis was mocked for, fired for, and ultimately institutionalized for, is still the single most powerful, fundamental tool we have in global public health.
When a novel global disease spreads in our modern world and the greatest medical agencies on Earth tell us that our very first line of defense is to vigorously scrub our hands with soap and water, we are following the literal, hard-fought instructions of a man who died alone in a straitjacket.
And it highlights a very uncomfortable, enduring truth about the nature of evidence. We like to flatter ourselves and believe that in a modern, rational society, evidence speaks for itself.
But it doesn't. Evidence is passive. It is just data on a page. It requires human beings who are willing to hear it, to internalize it, to update their worldview, and to act on it.
And human beings, no matter the century, are incredibly skilled at ignoring evidence that challenges their egos, threatens their status, or disrupts their comfortable paradigms.
It is so easy for us to sit here with our modern smartphones, our advanced antibiotics, and our electron microscopes, and laugh at the foolish doctors of 1846 who actually thought that foul smells could cause an infection. We think we are so much smarter than them.
But I want to leave you with a challenging thought to mull over, something to test your own susceptibility to the Semmelweis reflex. Think about a deeply held belief, or a scientific framework, or a fundamental societal norm that you currently trust with all your heart.
Something that feels as obvious to you as the miasma theory felt to Professor Klein.
Now imagine that tomorrow, a new piece of evidence comes along that completely dismantles that belief. Evidence that sounds absolutely absurd to you. Evidence that offends your pride, or suggests that you have been doing something wrong your entire life.
If you were presented with that data, would you be the one to patiently look at the numbers and adjust your paradigm?
Or would you be the one demanding that the messenger be thrown out of the room? What modern absurdity that we mock today might turn out to be the chlorinated water of tomorrow?
That's a question we should all be asking ourselves.
Keep asking hard questions. Keep challenging what you think you know. Stay deeply curious. And of course, wash your hands.